I am absolutely delighted to be here. It's really nice to see some friendly faces, some names I recognise, and also some people I don't. So thank you for spending your lunchtime with me. I'm hoping that all of you can currently see my slides and that you can't see my note slides. But let me know if that's different and I will play about with my computer settings as ever. There's a wealth of computer glitches that go on with things like this. So as Camilla said, my name's Lisa Ward and I'm here today to talk specifically about how we better enable a we. And I've said within the sector, and I guess the thing I should caveat this with is that the work and research I've done was very much framed around the rape crisis sector. My sense is that it can be extrapolated to the violence against women and girls sector much more broadly, but actually I also think it's true of many other sectors as well. So I hope that those of you that are joining from other sectors and other organisations will really be able to take this and think about how it might impact in your work. So first up, I realised that Camilla has already given you a bit of an introduction to me, but I think it's really important to caveat the work and the stance in which I come at it. So key things I think you need to know about me. First of all, I'm a survivor of both domestic and sexual abuse, and that's very much grounded in my work and the practice and the way I work within the sector. I've previously been a worker, as Camilla said, both the chief executive, but also a training and volunteer coordinator within a rape crisis centre. I'm also currently a trustee of Rape Crisis England and Wales and a trustee of a member centre over in Aylesbury, so still very much connected within the centre. And I've previously held a role as what was termed then an expert by experience within mental health services. So delivering training to professionals to think about how best to amplify the voices and how best to work with people who may be experiencing mental ill health and mental distress within their services. And then more recently, over the last 6 months, I've transitioned and I'm now working as a lived experience freelance consultant to a variety of organisations and individuals, so both statutory and third sector organisations, supporting organisations to think about what lived experience means for them and how they might be able to change their working practices to better engage the voices of people with lived experience. And then I consider myself a research, so I've recently completed my master's degree at London Met under the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit, looking specifically at this. And this topic is the culmination of 2.5 years worth of research, but 5 to 15 years worth of conversation, many of those with Liz Kelly that Camilla has already mentioned, but also with other individuals across the rape crisis sector. And it's key to me that this is not my research, this is actually the sector's research, the sector's learning. What I've tried to do is take voices and words from women within the sector and synthesize those into something that you can make sense of, but I consider it a shared piece of learning. So I guess, within all of those different hats and different experiences that I've had, it's worth recognizing that I am what I consider a situated researcher. So I cannot be completely objective. I don't believe that any research can be fully objective anyway, but I'm in it, I'm part of the research as well as somebody doing some of that research. And so one of the key things that I was thinking about when approaching this, and what I'm going to do is talk you through a bit of the background and the approach to the research, and then talk through the findings. There was lots of work taking place when I started. The Big Lottery were really keen that projects needed to be co-produced. There was lots of work on lived experience. There's a real move, I think, to ensuring that voices are embedded, but it often focuses on bringing people from the outside in. So it still talks about those who use services and those within services as two distinct and separate camps. And what I started to recognise was a bit of a disconnect and a bit of a sense of silence. So women within my network didn't appear to be speaking about their own experiences particularly readily. And I really wanted to start to think about that and unpick it and explore it from an internal perspective. So during my own time within the Rape Crisis Network, I'd often queried and questioned how other people understood me and my role as both a professional and a survivor. I felt at times there was a real synergy. So my lived experience of violence and abuse really informed my practice and how I worked. But at other times I felt like actually I had to deny or hide a part of myself in order to pass. So if I wanted to be a good enough professional, I couldn't talk about my lived experience. Or if I wanted to be a good enough survivor, I couldn't talk about also being a professional. And lots of personal conversations and visits to rape crisis centres across the network revealed a real sense of us. You know, there were spaces and places where these conversations about survivor status were taking place, but they weren't taking place publicly. At the same time, when I started having conversations with friends external to the movement, pretty much every single one of them said to me that they had made an assumption that anybody who worked within a rape crisis centre or a violence against women and girls service had experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence. That was the general public assumption. And so I was really curious about how one public assumption fitted but didn't necessarily fit within a network. And it felt like there was never a particularly clear directive within my centre, with other centres, about whether it was okay to talk about lived experience, whether that was useful or not. I sometimes worried that if I did talk about stuff from my own lived experience, was I creating some sort of power issue, you know, and potentially saying, well, my view is gospel because I've lived it and maybe you haven't. And even during my initial interview, I remember having this kind of thought process moment of wondering, could I say I was a survivor? Was that okay? Or would that change in interviews, panels, experience and understanding of me? You know, an experience of going to various conferences and events and seeing groups of survivors or focus groups on stage talking about their experiences whilst the professionals in the room were almost seen as other. And that not just being something that was true of the Rape Crisis Network, but actually of networks across the board, and something I had even done and taken part in terms of mental health sectors. You know, so for me, there was something big and seismic that was going on that really needed unpicking. So the first thing I start to do is think about, okay, well, does this exist? Is it there already? You know, why is it me that should do it? And what I found was actually that there's quite a lot of limited research into the sexual violence movement. So the key text that exists is a book by Jones and Cook, which was written in 2008, which really starts to break down the rape crisis movement. But that focuses mainly on internal shifts, such as finances, organizational structures, and it talks a lot about the impact of the loss of the Rape Crisis Federation, which was closing its doors at the time. And Rape Crisis England and Wales was the body that was coming up in its place. Other key things to note about when that text was written, there was just £50,000 across the entirety of the Rape Crisis Network through what was known as the Victims Fund in 2007. Its successor, the Rape Support Fund in 2019, offered £24 million across 3 years. So the size of the funding of the landscape had also changed quite dramatically over a 10-year period from the point at which that book had been written. And as I've said, you know, language of lived experience and co-production was beginning to rise. There were issues around potentially needing to professionalise services. Counselling provision, I think, has risen massively, you know, even in the last decade. You know, there's lots of adverts now for online, you know, BetterHelp, etc. People talk about counselling and therapy as quite common stuff, whereas I think 15 years ago, you know, it was quite shameful to say you were accessing some sort of therapy, and we didn't have the same stuff going on as we do now. And of course, we've also seen, you know, massive media shifts, you know, the abuses of Jimmy Savile coming to light, the Me Too movement. You know, there's still lots of stuff going on in public media nearly every day about sexual violence, and it's become much more part and parcel of day-to-day conversation. We've also had things like the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and commissioning landscapes have changed. So we've moved to a localisation agenda where funding is now much more delivered by local authorities than on a national level. So I set about thinking about what were the aims of doing a piece of research. If I was going to do something, what was meaningful and what was needed. And what I felt was important was to think about the herstory of the rape crisis movement. And I use the phrase herstory very deliberately there, because it's ours as a group of women, not a group of men's. To investigate a bit more how rape crisis centres currently understand the notion of a we. What are centres thinking, feeling, was my experience just mine, or is it shared across the network? And then to analyse and think about the potential risks and benefits of self-disclosure by workers. And when I talk about workers, I mean both paid staff and also volunteers within an organisation. They are all providing some form of work. And you'll see I've quoted Liz there, who wrote a blog which is on the Tavistock website if you want to go and find it. And she was talking about this same thing. So, a conversation that needed to be had about what has changed, not just for centres, but what has also changed and shifted within centres. And so this work really focuses on that internal aspect. So the first thing I set about doing was reviewing that herstory, and I started to look at the existing literature that was out there. So I analysed a range of documents from the UK and USA in particular, got to be a geek for a while and pulled out all of these old zines and paper printed documents that existed, started looking through journals, etc., that were taking place. And then also looked at the academic text around things like feminist counselling, around words like co-production, around lived experience. So really tried to draw out what do we already know and what are the gaps in knowledge. And in doing that, what I began to find was a variety of notions and themes that were taking place. So the first being a recognition of the personal being political. So early writings are about rape crisis centres very much talk about political activism as a way to counter patriarchal norms which enable sexual violence. They talk a lot about speak out groups, about awareness raising. I think it's fair to say that in the early days, they were probably more activist groups than support centres. We saw the rise of the Reclaim the Night marches. So lots of work taking place to just raise awareness and consciousness. And the early research also drew out and understood Liz's idea of sexual violence as being a continuum. So recognizing it as something that sexual violence which impacts every woman in some way. And that's not to say that every woman has been raped, but I think it is fair to say that every woman has an experience of sexual violence, whether that's harassment or catcalling or gendered sexual violence in some way, shape or form. If we think of sexual violence as a much broader thing, we can start to unpick the way in which that has played out for everybody. And I've put a quote in there which talked about the opening of the Manchester rape crisis back in '91, about the discussions they were having and the fact that they'd overlooked how much time they needed to just think about their own experiences within that. So a real awareness from centres when they were opening, that they had their own experience within it. The research also drew out some senses of the changing nature, so as I talked about the changes in commissioning process, early writings were talking about linking that support with the activism. But what I found was a real increase in counselling provision and a shift away from group work and self-disclosure to actions which help look at rape as a social phenomenon. And instead, what we've done is shifted much more towards what Vera Gray terms a sickness model. So we talk a lot about experiences of trauma now being understood as things like PTSD, or earlier on it was referred to as rape trauma syndrome. I think it's very common for individuals to come to a rape crisis centre and have some sort of medical diagnosis for them. And that's not to say there may not be medical diagnosis going on alongside, but we've moved to a point where trauma in itself has almost become a medical diagnosis. And it also talked about living dynamics, so competing pressures between what centres wanted to do around political activism and service provision. And how do you balance those two things, particularly if funding landscapes are changing? There was a move, as I've said, towards that individual counselling approach. So, you know, people now very much seeing one-to-one support as the gold standard. We've seen changes from the Ministry of Justice talk about cope and recovery frameworks. We talk about funding being very much about on supporting individuals rather than working to end sexual violence. You know, so one of the big things for the big lottery funding for the centre that I was working at was that the project was both offering support to young people, but also wanting to work with young people to change their understanding of sexual violence, to try and prevent some of it happening in the first place. And that was quite rare and quite uncommon 5 years ago. There's been a real shift in who gets to use the term counsellor. I think we now understand it as somebody who's undergone professional qualifications. That was not the case when rape crisis centres first started. And we've moved towards a standardisation of services. So there are lots of service standards which exist. And I should be really clear that standards are a really good thing. Okay, I'm not saying like we should get rid of things which hold us to account or make sure we're doing good work. But I think it is important to recognise that the more we standardise our work, or the more we say there's a particular way to do something, the more impact that will have. And that does change dynamics within centres. And then I also found that there was lots of self-disclosure going on in the early days. That was really important. It was a political act. So early rape crisis centres were founded on speak out groups. People may have heard of, you know, consciousness raising groups, you know, spaces and places where people were just coming together and sharing their experiences, very much like Me Too did in an online arena. Me Too really created, I think, and re-highlighted this sense of reciprocal recognition. So the minute you say Me Too to somebody, you're saying, I understand, I acknowledge what you've been through, I have some experience which may be able to mean we can better relate to each other. And if sexual violence impacts every woman, then self-disclosure is actually a very natural progression. It normalizes the experience of women, and in my mind it turns it from an us and them to a we, because we are all sharing in that shame experience. But there are caveats to that. You know, there are risks, as I talked about in terms of my own experience, that some personals may become more politically important than others. And for me, one of the prime examples of that is actually the Me Too phenomenon. So Me Too was founded by a Black activist, Tarana Burke, in the USA quite some time ago, but it didn't gain traction until it was used by a white woman to talk about issues in Hollywood. You know, and there's something in that intersectionality of whose voice becomes more important and who gets you know, even credited with the rise of the Me Too movement, that becomes really important in our thinking, that we need to be mindful of. So, you know, we have to recognise that self-disclosure, you know, also potentially plays a part in that. The other thing that's really important, I guess, is to think about what is co-production? What does that even mean? When we say lived experience engagement or an expert by experience, what are we talking about? And there's lots of group out there that are framing this, they're doing work on it. So there is the ladder of co-production that exists, that was created by I think it was the National Co-Production Advisory Group, but it may also be Think Local, Act Political, or Think Political, Act Local. And they talk about the different layers and different levels at which you can do co-production. There's NSUN's full principle of engagement framework, which talks about the best way to embed people within research and service delivery. You know, if you type co-production or lived experience engagement into the internet, you can get lots of toolkits and lots of best practice. You know, Women's Aid this week have put information out as well about the best way to do that. But again, all of them talk about how you do that in terms of bringing people in rather than within an organisation. And at the same time, what I was certainly hearing when I was going to commissioning events was commissioners saying to me, it's not enough for you to use your lived experience as evidence of why we need to commission a service. It needs to be other individuals outside of your service. Whilst at the same time, trusts and foundations are out there saying, oh, we've got this funding pot for lived experience leaders. We want lived experience people leading and heading up organisations. And so it creates this real split of, well, when do you get to be a lived experience leader? Do you tailor who you are based on who you're pitching for funding for? How do we join up those dots and reconnect it? And what is important? And the other thing that really struck me as I went through that Cook and Jones book was also a comment from a rape crisis centre that said, we do such a good job of moving on that they don't feel they have to give something back by volunteering. And I couldn't get my head around this sense of, okay, so we know sexual violence potentially impacts everyone, but we also think it's problematic that maybe people want to come back to a centre. And I recognise and understand that need for people not to come back because they feel they have a debt to pay in some way. But I don't necessarily deem it a good job of moving people on, that people end up at a point completely disconnected from their experience again. So I wanted to unpick that more. I wanted to understand how centres were thinking about that. The other key aim was thinking about how rape crisis centres understand those things, and to think about the risks and benefits of self-disclosures. And to do that, rather than going on the historic literature that existed, what I did was 3 things. So there was a survey that went out to Rape Crisis England and Wales members across the network, and I'm sure there are individuals here today that will have willingly taken part in that survey, for which I am ever appreciative. I also undertook interviews with 5 what I call long-memoried women within the network. So women who have been engaged in the violence against women and girls and rape crisis movement in some way, shape or form for a period of more than 10 years. And then there was also a consensus and feedback group at Rape Crisis Conference to really think about, okay, here's my first understanding of the research. What do you think it means, and how can we use that to evidence what we might want to do to change stuff in the future? So the methodology, for those of you interested in that kind of thing, it was grounded in feminist theory. As I've said, it used women as a source of knowledge. So it really made those involved in the research the people who were also helping me unpack what that meant. And in order to do that and co-create that meaning, I used topic guides and had conversations with women rather than question and answer interview methods. It recognised my own life experience as impacting on the research, and having, you know, that sense of social relationship. So I was explicit with everybody all the way through the process about the different roles I held. And I was particularly aware, you know, that being a CEO of a rape crisis centre at a time, and also being a trustee of a national umbrella organisation, may change the dynamic of how people spoke to me. So I wanted to be explicit about that, and also explicit about how this piece of research was very separate to what I was doing. In terms of the respondents, 28 out of 36 centres took part in the survey, so 72%, with a geographic spread across the whole of the Rape Crisis England and Wales region. There was at least 1 member centre in every area of the regions that we're divided into that took part. And in terms of roles of individuals that took place, there was a fairly reasonable split of different types of individuals. There is a big skew towards those in senior management roles. I think probably that's because that's where these kind of questionnaires get to, and most staff go, oh, that's a job for such and such, and hand it that way. And there weren't any, as far as I'm aware, volunteer workers. Or at least nobody who identified themselves in that sense, you know. So there is something to think about in all of this in terms of who took part and how that may also frame the learning. The interviews were all with women over 18. They were based on convenient samples. So most of the women that took part were known to me or connected to me by individuals. And that was a process of saying, who's been around in the network for a long period of time? Who should I be talking to? But they had different relationships within the sectors. So they weren't all currently working in rape crisis centres. Some of them were previous staff members or volunteers who had become consultants in some way, shape or form. Some of them were trustees to the network who had previously been staff members. Some of them were staff members who had left and gone on to do other things. So a split of people who had remained within the sector and people who had moved on. And they were all enabled to check their transcripts, request amendments and retractions to protect them, and so that they had space to really reflect on what they'd said and their understanding of it. And they all used pseudonyms within the findings of the research. And then in terms of the consensus and feedback group, that took place online in the middle of COVID. It had 21 women from, 25 women, including myself, from 21 different centres. So again, quite a big spread of centres and membership organisations reflected. This group were all currently working or volunteering within a centre, and there were lots of volunteers present in this space. And what this enabled was a space to form a group level understanding of what the findings were saying, and also an exploration of what changes the network might want to see, which becomes really important when I move on to recommendations, that these are recommendations that are born out of just not just my voice, but also the voice of other women within the sector. And it recognised that sense of feminism being both theory and practice. So the research, as far as I was concerned, there was very little point in researching something unless I felt like it might be able to make a tangible difference at some point, which is where the recommendations come out. So, as I've said, it was also a very personal journey. I was out, for want of a better phrase, as a survivor in my own centre, but it wasn't necessarily something that I was using publicly. It wasn't something I had declared from a platform like this, for example, and it took a process of examining to think about, did I want to do that? What would that mean? Recognizing that people had said to me, once you've spoken, you can't unspeak it. At the same time, I felt like it was disingenuous to say that, survivors' voices should be amplified if I wasn't in somehow amplifying my own voice within that. But that did also mean that the research had a real personal impact. And there were certainly times where I read some of the findings and had what I can only describe as a bit of a heart sink moment. So there were language in the surveys that felt quite protectionistic, can never say that word, and paternalistic. And I use the word paternal quite deliberately because I think it felt like it was a recreation of the patriarchy that I thought rape crisis centres were stood against. So lots of words around boundaries and triggering and safety, and that sense that centres had a duty of care for individuals. And that's not to say they don't, but there was a question for me about how you tally up that duty of care for survivors against an empowerment approach, against an approach that says a survivor is an expert in her own experience. She is the expert in her own life. She is the person that knows best what she needs, and how you could put those two things together. And reading within the survey that there was one centre who said that they never allowed women to have access services to return to the centre because of boundary issues felt to me quite judgmental. It felt very difficult to think about how and why and when you would do that and what the reason and logic would be. And when I fed that back to the consensus group towards the end, there's when I asked a question about what excluding people from services might look like or what it might do to survivors in the questionnaire, one respondent said that, it's potential that people will feel like they're being unfairly precluded from supporting other women, and that may recreate a further sense of injustice, so an injustice of experiencing sexual violence, potentially an injustice from the criminal justice system, and then a further potential injustice from a service that, for all intents and purposes, there to support you and amplify your voice in some way. But I also felt that there was the potential here to change working practice. There was something that could come out of it. And I should say that within rape crisis centres, I've already seen this beginning to happen for those that have been involved in some of the discussions with me. They've changed practice in certain places to really reflect that. But it's interesting that one respondent in the group said that in the domestic violence sector, it felt like people were being actively discouraged from talking about their survivor status. And so when we opened up a space at conference to have a conversation about lived experience within our movement, that to them felt really liberating and really refreshing. And so I think there's something there for services across the board, not even within the violence against women and girls sector, but, within mental health services, within the homeless movement, to really think about spaces and places to create those conversations. And so there were three key findings, which links back, to some of that evidence I started drawing on from the literature, was that there was something going on about how services had been professionalized, that changes to the funding landscape, changes to the counselling industry, and also a movement away from older collective structures of organisations had changed how the rape crisis centres were doing their work. And when I talk about collective structures, I'm talking about internal organisation systems that remove hierarchies as much as possible. So the idea of having a CEO or senior management teams would have been unheard of within a collective group. They were places where hierarchy and power was deliberately flattened. I found stuff around speaking versus silencing. So that question of when can people speak, who holds the power, who gets to say when people do or don't speak, what is the impact on those who work in services if you do or don't speak, what's the impact on people that use services, and what does co-producing from a rape crisis perspective look like, and how may that or may not be different to other forms of co-production. And then issues of perspective. So who are the individuals that gatekeep the power? How are we or aren't we embedding the personal as political? How do we understand feminism within centres in 2022? And how do we conceptualise and understand within centres what it means to be a survivor? So in terms of findings, in terms of changes to the funding landscape, what I began to find was that some workers said that they really wanted to speak out in public forums, but they had this sense, or they had been told, that it was viewed as unprofessional somehow. So they shouldn't be speaking out about their views. There was this sense that services needed to be viewed as safe, that they needed to deliver medicalised support, and words like disassociated, boundaries, and safe were used frequently. And that for me really links to this medicalised model of sexual violence and what Fiona Vera Gray calls a sickness model of sexual violence, that we've somehow put the onus on the individuals who've experienced it as ill or unwell in some way, shape or form, and shifted that away from perpetrators. And there's also been this massive shift in the sector of what statutory services want to fund, as well as how they want to fund them. So I talked about that change from kind of central government funding, but I also think if you look at what they're funding, there's been a real shift. So we've seen a massive rise over the last decade in the number of SARCs that exist across the country. There is disproportionate levels of funding for ISVA provision over other types of support and services. There's also more funding for individual counselling than group work. So this real move towards a criminal justice and medical framework, as opposed to a group process. And I've got some quotes for you for the next few slides, because I think women's voices really speak here much more than what I can say. So Jane, who was one of the long memory women that I interviewed, when she was talking about SARCs, she said that they were very much set up as that, you can have really good support without having to go near a feminist. I mean, I don't think anybody actually ever got up on a platform and said that, but it was very much the underlying story that we know how to do this. We will treat rape trauma syndrome, and we won't just leave you with a bunch of loony feminists. So something when SARCs are emerging about that feminism being a dirty word somehow. And then one of the other long-memoried women said to me, we had to stop having a public face around our activism because we felt severely judged, and that if we wanted to kind of open up something that was where we're providing support, that we had to have the professionalization, and that meant totally disassociating ourselves from our own lived experience. And I think it's really interesting that she used the word disassociation there, when we know that's also a word that survivors often use and experience they often have about their experiences of abuse. So there's also something about how those dynamics of abuse play out in how services are or aren't enabled to deliver. In terms of changes to the counselling industry, I'm sure many of you are aware that there's been a move and continues to be a move in terms of how we understand counselling. So in the really early days, rape crisis centres used their own internal training models. There's documentation from the Rape Crisis Federation, you know, that talks about volunteers being sufficiently trained if they've gone through a rape crisis training model. And any face-to-face support of any form was called counselling. In its broadest form. And I think what we've moved to now in 2022 is an understanding that counselling is something taught by external agencies. It's something that is accredited. It's something that people pay to do. It's a professional skill set. And that maps into the rise of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy and the National Counselling Society. And some of you may be aware that there's currently a conversation going on with the BACP about how they accredit different levels of skills within counsellors. So how they create a framework that evidences where people are in their counselling journey, you know, so it's become this professionalised status. And again, you know, that's not to say that's a bad thing. You know, I think it's important that we move away from a place where anyone can call themselves a counsellor, even if they have no skills whatsoever, you know, because that risks danger to individuals. But there is something about how far up that professionalisation path you go and what gets lost if you don't use rape crisis training with individuals. As I've said before, there was a link in understanding of things like rape trauma syndrome and medicalisation of experiences around PTSD or complex PTSD, you know, so understandings of post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, and also borderline personality disorder being another one that I think we hear really commonly, that individuals who've experienced some sort of violence or abuse are diagnosed with. And there's something for me in that about the diagnosing and medicalising of an individual experience rather than looking at an issue with a wider society that enables violence against women and girls in the first place. And so within that, these changes all create this growth of healing, of treatment, of recovery, of, you know, kind of gold standards of where people are at. And Jane said to me when I was talking to her, she said, women didn't ring up thinking they were going to talk to a professional expert on rape trauma syndrome. They thought they were ringing up somebody who would listen, somebody who would sympathise, and somebody who might have been there themselves. And so Jane is talking about a time in the 1980s, 1990s, where experiences of rape crisis centres were very different. Meanwhile, Sadie said to me that it's linked to this idea that actually there's a therapeutic journey that women must go on, that survivors can be enabled to go on. It starts with their experience of abuse and ends with healing. And that medical idea is something that is guided through professional therapeutic services. There's no doubt that professional therapy can be extremely helpful and beneficial to women who've experienced trauma and abuse. However, it's not the only part of whatever that journey might be. And I think that's really important that we remember that it's, you know, individuals are holistic and there are all sorts of things that change a woman's relationship with herself and with her experiences of violence and abuse. The collective structure is something that's been noted a lot within our sector and something that we know has been lost. But I think what we haven't maybe come to terms with is that conversations about lived experience also get lost when you start to lose those collective structures. And they also move to a place where there's not only an us and them between those who use services and those who deliver services, but also within a service. And it's something I certainly experienced as I moved up to a management level in an organisation, that conversations I might have had with people previously were no longer happening, that I was perceived as other, I was seen as a threat at times, you know, phrases like the management, rather than naming individual women that sat in those roles, created a real dichotomy within a service. And it could also be argued that that move away from collective structures is also what lost some of the group work And for me, that also reduces access to a sense of justice. So McGlynn and Westmoreland in 2019 talked about an idea of kaleidoscopic justice, looking with survivors about how they could gain a sense of justice outside a criminal justice system. And what they found is things like connectiveness, recognition, and prevention as all being really important for somebody's sense of justice. But if you're not doing prevention-based activities, you're not connecting people through groups, and you're not talking about disclosures from staff, how do you create any of those things? So there's something for me within all of this which has potentially reduced that justice somehow. And so Claire said to me that they learned quite quickly that when they were in their own group or their own environment, they were really easily able to talk about their own lived experience. And that was massive. That was a game changer. And again, that was talking about the really early times. Whereas Jess, who had worked in a rape crisis centre much more recently, said to me, there was no connection. They were just invisible. We didn't know when the trustee meetings were. We didn't know what the agenda was. We didn't know what they discussed. We didn't know anything about them at all. That shifted things from a point where it was them and us within the rape crisis centre to from outside the rape crisis centre, and it became an us and them within the organisation. So again, you see how that shift takes place over time. Then under the speaking and silencing, a lot of the evidence here came out of the surveys and the interviews. So what I found from the questionnaire was that only 3 out of 28 centres explicitly asked for anything about lived experience on a job specification, either as a desirable or essential criteria. And only 2 centres said that they asked explicitly about lived experience at interview. And no centres could say how many survivors they had within their workforce, and no one responded to the questionnaire and said, well, it's all of them, because we understand sexual violence as a continuum. Lots talked in the questionnaire about the need for boundaries. Many suggested those who had used services weren't appropriate to then become staff volunteers, and people said that contrasted the historical approaches of the DV sector, where people would go in as the resident and end up as the CEO. And so it creates this dichotomy almost about who holds the power, who gets to speak when, how do we open up conversation. Questionnaire responders felt that there was potentially minimal impact actually by not asking anything about sexual violence at interview, and that potentially asking at interview posed an ethical dilemma. But again, they used words like triggered, recovered, and healing, suggesting somehow that we as a sector have also brought into that discourse of medicalisation, and I would potentially argue that it positions sexual violence as something that permanently scars people, that is in need for constant healing. It's a permanent wound rather than something that people could use to their own benefit. And there was a sense that while certain spaces or groups within centres were more appropriate than others to disclose, some also felt that people were more silenced in different spaces. So all interviewees highlighted internal training as being a space where conversation about lived experience did actually arise, but they reflected that role impacted ability to speak. And so, there's something about, if we open up dialogue within interview processes, what does that mean? How do we do it ethically? How do we make sure we don't place a burden of truth on people to have to say something if they don't want to, but how do we also enable it to be a space where people can speak if they want to? And so Jeff said, I'd say between 50 to 70% of everybody who worked there or volunteered there did so because they were survivors of some sort, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And obviously nobody's ever forced to say who they are or what they are, but you would think that within a rape crisis centre, you wouldn't have to talk about your experiences quietly. And somebody else in the questionnaire also talked about the fact that women with lived experience may not recognise the value of their own lived experience in supporting women and the organisation, or at least feel like the organisation doesn't see their lived experience as valuable. They may question whether they can be open about their own experiences through the recruitment process, and even question whether they can or should apply, or whether this is the kind of organisation they want to work for. So I think there's something in that that's really important. People spoke about public voice. So there were lots of spaces where public voice were re-emerging, but it was often not led by women working in the centres. And this is something I certainly see really commonly, of lots of people speaking out on Twitter and social media, and actually saying that they want to use their voice, they want to raise their right to anonymity. But interestingly, I think, centres in particular have this fear about survivors speaking up, that they want to protect people. And some centres were saying that they wouldn't support individuals who had experienced sexual abuse to talk publicly and to waive their right to anonymity, that they were on their own if that was something they want to do. But meanwhile, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and the Truth Project has really enabled that space to speak truth. It's really encouraged people to come forward and start talking about it. And those who'd been in the rape crisis sector for quite a period of time talked about the ability to speak one's truth and talk publicly as the core of what was specialist about rape crisis organisations. So Claire on ICSA said, that what ICSA has done is enabled some individuals to speak their truth where they haven't had that space. And that's the core of our organisation. It's our root and core. When that changes, then we become generic. It's what makes us special and makes us different. So then the other thing under speaking and silencing was this impact on people that deliver services issue around secondary trauma, but also an understanding of a rape crisis centre being an awakening space. So, that juxtaposition of Me Too being a signal call of a shared experience, being a way to regain power and speak out, but that being juxtaposed with issues around secondary trauma, the need to put boundaries in place in order to protect people. And the focus on policies is more on the perceived negative impact, in my opinion, than the potential benefits. So boundaries potentially fail to acknowledge that all rape crisis workers are susceptible to negative impacts of the work, just as those in other services are. So there's evidence that those in emergency medical services are just as impacted by secondary trauma as rape crisis workers. And if you don't allow and enable the space to talk about that, you're almost recreating that trauma. There's also plenty of evidence to suggest that actually engagement in activism and within rape crisis work is a tool for healing, documented by both Rothschild and Herman in their work about, how being able to come into a centre and give something back or do something different and turn your story into something powerful that changes life for other people can also be personally really healing. And it creates this idea of a false gap where we think that survivors must be sufficiently healed in order to deliver the work of a service. And I don't know how, you create a point at which somebody is healed. Like, what does that endpoint look like? How do we define it? Most survivors would say that it isn't something that will ever go away, but you find a way to balance life around it. And then there's a risk of a double bind, so there's also a sense that people who come in and work in services actually learn a huge amount. When I came into the rape crisis sector, I didn't know a huge amount around sexual violence, but in doing so, by being in the sector, I learned loads. And by learning about it from a political lens and a wider feminist agenda, I also started to unpick and unpack some of my own experiences and developed my own healing within that. So that desire to avoid that blurring between the workers and those who use services may actually in turn be more damaging, and there is a risk that what we end up doing is denying support to women working within a service to access support or, spaces to talk about what it's doing to them and their internal processes. So in the consensus group, one of the individuals said that in joining the centre, they had really begun to unpack some of their own experiences and knowledge. And they were signposted by the Rape Crisis Centre. They were working to an employment assistant allowance. But actually they found the experience awful and would have been much better supported by the Rape Crisis Centre themselves. So the services best placed to support people are denying that in some ways. And then there's this sense of the capacity for people who speak out to create better outcomes for survivors, to build unimaginable hope for those that are using services that can see themselves reflected, to build that social understanding of violence against women and girls as something that impacts us all. You know, and in not speaking out, we potentially deny a whole self, as Fiona Vera Gray calls it, you know, so that disconnect and dichotomy between two individuals. And then, as I say, you know, something of co-production in a rape crisis context, that lots of people talked about co-production still being an us and them, rather than it being a we, that it talks about two groups coming together, but that those two groups are different rather than two groups being connected as a joint we, and how the medical model can potentially overlap and interact with that. So Jane said, if there's co-production, there's a this person and a that person, but there isn't they were still outside, they weren't inside. And then finally, very briefly, before I bring you on to the final conclusions, questions around gatekeepers of power. So power emerged in multiple ways across the research. That asking about lived experience might create pressure or obligations, as I said, but conversely, not asking may mean that people weren't encouraged to apply. And it mirrored some of the findings of the REVA study. So the REVA study is the routine inquiry into violence and abuse in health services, which found that survivors really welcomed being asked by health professionals about their experience, but staff felt underskilled to ask the question. And that potentially also played out, I think, in recruitment processes. That time boundaries around volunteering and suitability metrics counter empowerment models. And I also think there's an issue of intersectionality there, because it's always a boundary about somebody that's used a rape crisis service re-entering, but very rarely do we ask somebody about a boundary between private therapy and wanting to work in an organisation. So if you've got money and you can pay for private support and then go and join a rape crisis centre, that's fine. But if you don't have money and you need to wait for a free to access service, we then potentially put a time boundary in place. And so there's something around, you know, that move to support service, that loss of the personal being political, and losing that understanding of the consequence that that may have for staff as well. But, you know, activism can work as a salve against cynicism, as some people talked about it. So what I tried to do was create a model of how it happened, why it happened, and where it came from. So on the left-hand side, in the early 70s and 80s, the personal and the political were really tightly embedded and reflected together. As rape crisis centres moved away from collective structures, as commissioning increased and regulations around the charity sector changed, and counselling professionalised, that gulf became wider. And what I now think is we're at a point, with thanks, you know, to the Me Too movement in particular, that conscious raising work is back on the agenda, that lived experience is something that is back on the agenda, that funders are placing much more emphasis on co-production, and therefore we have an opportunity to do something different. So the things I think we need to do that are different, we need to think about flattened power and feminist analysis within our work. So we have to make sure that services understand and use positive power frameworks. We need to re-embed the notion that the personal is political and create spaces and places to have those conversations. We need to ensure that training for all new workers includes information on Kelly's continuum of sexual violence, and that we enable a space and a language of lived experience for all women, whilst recognising that difference of experience between individuals. We need to move back to a space of having more collective activist work. So we need to find ways and think about how we enable survivors to speak publicly, how we give them the tools and resource to do that. And of course, we need to ensure that policies and procedures do so in a way that protects their safety, but also within an empowerment model that gives them the autonomy to make decisions about what they want to say. We need to make sure that services are enabled to invest equal energy in campaigning work as they are in providing support. I've long since said that if all we do is provide support, we will never end violence against women and girls. And I think that is the collective aim of all of the sector. And whilst we won't get there in my lifetime, I still think it's really important that that campaigning work and that active voice is given space to become important again. We need to reclaim language and move away from counsel and speak. And my final slide will give you an example on what I mean by that. And we need to make sure that professional standards within our work are upheld, but not at the expense of rape crisis specialist knowledge, which is derived from the lived experience of the women within our network. And then finally, I think we need to make sure that we move to a place where we've got a culture of naming. So we need to build systems and processes which allow everybody who wishes to, and I think it's really important that it's wishes to, so that there is no obligation to speak internally if they wish to do so. We need to include statements on recruitment documents about rape crisis understandings of sexual violence and think about how we can better encourage applications. And so one of the examples I give here is that we often these days put statements on our recruitment policies where we say we are underrepresented by disabled or Black or racially minoritized women and would warmly welcome applications from this group. Why are we not doing the same thing about lived experience? It's a simple statement that suggests that you recognise many of the individuals looking to apply for a job might do that. We need to make sure that our centres have adequate support systems in place for survivors beyond EAP processes, that we create spaces in order to have those conversations about the impact of the work on ourselves. And we need to work to reduce the barriers between the us and them and move away from understanding Helia as a linear process with a start and an end point, but something that's complicated and messy and that will change across the life course of people. And we need to explore how self-disclosures can be used more effectively across all areas of our practice. And then the final slide that I'll leave up for you for food of thought is just how that plays into language. So how language such as counsellor and ISVA or service user really create the us and them. You know, it says I am different to you in some ways. And so I would propose if we even just adjusted some of our language in some way, we may move to a better position of having more of an we. And so I guess, you know, final thing to recognize is that what I found through the research was not necessarily have we lost the we, because I don't think we ever did. The question is, to what extent have we started to lose it, and what is the work we need to do to make sure it doesn't disappear fully?